In this example problem, we're going to be Heartwood manufacturing. And Heartwood manufacturing has two separate pools that they are going to use for overhead costs. They have their regular, in this case, operations overhead, coming from things like their factory rent, their machine depreciation, etc. That is going to be based upon the amount of direct labor hours that get used in production. And then they also have their machine setup overhead. And their machine setup overhead contains things like materials handling, indirect materials, etc. And they're going to base this one, how they allocate it, based upon the number of hours required not for operations, but for machine setups. And this question is tasking us with figuring out, based upon this information, how much overhead are we going to allocate? Well, let's go through and crunch the numbers that we have right here. So the first thing that I want to do is figure out my predetermined overhead operations overhead rate is going to be. Well, to do that, I got the formula down on the bottom. We're going to take our total operations overhead and we're going to divide it by the amount of labor hours, direct labor hours that are needed in production because direct labor hours is the cost driver for that particular cost pool. So here I can go and I can find my total operations overhead. And that right here, since this is the operations table, is going to be the amount that we have there, 873,000 divided by the total quantity of the driver that we're going to put into production. So the driver for this is direct labor hours required for production. It's going to be 145,500. And when I divide that out, I come up with six. So $6 per labor hours, how we're going to allocate overhead from our operations pool, if you will. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can read everything. And it's going to be the same all the way down the line. Like we have five different models of pine board over here, but the different models aren't going to have their own unique rate. So I'm going to go back into my formula really fast, make both of these absolute. So I can use the handy dandy fill handle to fill it in for all five of my models. Everything is going to have operations overhead. It is assigned to it at a rate of $6 per labor hour that it takes. Underneath the next column we got to figure out over here is the direct machine setup labor hours that it's going to take for each unit. Well, in this case, this is the quantity of the driver that we are going to have for that pool. For overhead, for operations overhead, it was given in this problem that each one of these takes a certain amount of labor hours to do. Over here, we're going to figure out how many hours across all five units on average does it take to set up for one singular unit. And I can take this by taking the total setup labor hours that are going to be required for all of production and dividing it by the total number of units that are going to be produced. So here, let's find our total labor setup hours. And it's down here in the machine setup overhead cost section that we're going to need 15,000 hours for production. I'm going to want to fill handle again, so let me make that absolute. And then we need to divide that by the total quantity of units that we're making, which I can find here. Adding this all together is 105,000. It's also given up here in the units to be produced in the top. Wherever you want to grab it from, I'm going to grab it from right here. And that comes up to rounded off the two decimals, 0.14. It's really like the 1/7, if you will. So pretty crazy decimal going on over there, but we're going to have that same rate for all of our units. And then we've got our predetermined, if I could spell would be fantastic, determined machine setup overhead rate. So what is the total amount of setup overhead that we are going to incur? Is it this $1.683 million? No, because that's the total amount of overhead we're accumulating out of both pools. The 873 was the total amount that we had from our regular operations. The total amount that we got coming from machine setups is right there, $810,000. And if we divide that by our total amount of hours we're going to spend setting up, which we're given over here is 15,000, we're going to get how much we're spending per setup. So I'm going to take my total setup overhead, 810,000. Again, I'm going to make this absolute. And I'm going to divide by the 15,000 hours, making that absolute, that we are going to have to expend to pay labor for to keep setting up our machines to make new batches of these different types of pine boards. And when I enter that out, it comes out to $54. So for every hour we spend setting up a machine to make these different types of pine models that we have, it's causing us to incur $54 in machine setup overhead costs. And now I have all the information that I need to figure out what amount of overhead is going to have to go into each of our five respective models coming out of our two different cost pools. And how do you assign overhead? Well, in this case, you would take the number of units you're producing of that model, multiply it by the quantity of the driver. So it would be the direct labor hours per unit for our operations overhead, and it would be our machine setup hours for our machine setup overhead. And then you multiply it by your predetermined rate. So again, it's going to be $6 for our operations overhead, and our predetermined rate for machine setups is $54 per hour. So what I get to do is in this cell, I'm going to say this is equal to, and I'm just going to fill in the formula. Let's go with operations overhead first. We're making 14,500 pine arches. Each one of those takes a hour to produce, and we allocate it's $6 per hour out of our operations overhead pool. This isn't going to be the final answer yet, but I'm going to close that and hit enter right now. That's 87,000. But that's not $87,000 in total overhead that's going to the pine arches. That's $87,000 in overhead that's going to the pine arches just out of the operations pool. We still need to put more costs in there for the costs that are going to be coming out of the other pool, our machine setup overhead pool. But what am I going to do? I'm going to take that formula that I have, which again was just multiplying those three numbers together, and I am going to add to it the amount of overhead that should be coming out of the other pool. So plus, and I'm going to open my parentheses again. We're making 14,500 units still, times the 0.14 hours per unit it takes to set up our machines, times the $54 per hour we're saying that it costs to set up. And now that's going to come out to be 198,857.14. And I'll do it one more time for the cathedral pine. Same process over here. Open a first set of parentheses, and it's the units produced times the quantity of the driver per unit. And this is labor hours our driver, so another one right here, times our predetermined overhead allocation rate for allocating from the operations pool. I'm going to close that parenthesis. And to it, I'm going to add in another set of parentheses the number of units that we are producing times the quantity of the driver machine setup labor hours that we're using for the allocation from the machine setup pool times the $54 per hour. And looks just like it was above. When I put all that math in, I come up with $205,714.29. And because I'm just doing the same procedures with the way I have these cells set up, I can just do this and fill handle and everything. We find out from a little math, the pine shakers are going to have 334,285.71 assigned to them. The pine slabs are going to have 342,857.14 assigned to them, and the pine bead boards are going to have $601,285.71 assigned to them. And all in all, across all five of our different product models, we are going to allocate out $1,683,000, which should look awful familiar. So in this case, we are allocating out exactly what we thought we were going to incur for total overhead costs. And based upon that estimate, this is how much overhead should go into each of our different models.